Well, we're going through a great, big, huge task. We have 16 horoscopes, and one by one we're looking at 4 facets of each of the 16 horoscopes. And we'll go through them all one more time and summarize and try to get an overall big picture. It's going to take us several years. We'll just keep on going. One of the bad points about all of this is that by the time we get back to a horoscope from the last time we visited, we have forgotten some of the other things. One of the good things about this kind of way of doing things is that we can compare horoscopes and we can contrast them with each other and see what is similar and what is different and how the same thing is used in different ways. And we're going to do very little bit of that tonight. When we looked at the personality of Gandhi, we did a very little study in the nature of power. If you remember, Gandhi had Mars rising in Scorpio in the first house. And it had a lot of aspects, but among them was an opposition to Pluto. From the opposition of Mars and Pluto in Scorpio and Taurus, we were looking at a study of how people use power. Now when we get to the Mishima chart, Mishima has Mars rising in Aries, which is another martial sign. And this time, though, Mars is in the 12th house rather than the 1st house. And in the Mishima chart, we have Mars square to Pluto rather than opposite. Now, Mishima was famous, world famous, especially in Japan, his home. He was very famous. But he didn't have the power to influence an entire nation. Gandhi had a following of hundreds of millions of people. And it wasn't the part of Mishima to try and free people from a foreign occupation. But in effect, he tried to do something like that, and that's what we're going to look at. So Mishima had power, but it was on a much smaller scale, and it wasn't sufficient to do a really comparative study. Mars and Pluto combinations can mean other things than power. And it is one of those other things that we're going to study. The thing we most want to look at in the chart of Mishima with Mars and Pluto in square is fascism. Mishima was de facto a fascist. He was admittedly and unapologetically fascist. Fascism is predicated on discipline and control. Both discipline and control are very strong keywords for Mars and Pluto aspects. Normally, we discipline ourselves in order to gain control. Most of us are really not in control of ourselves. We're erratic, and we do inconsistent things and purposeless things. People do have gods, and they do have religions and philosophies of life toward which they bend themselves. However, control and application are not very firm, and they're not very extensive in our being. That doesn't mean we're random, but it does mean that we do a lot of inconsistent things. We're not even aware of the fact that we do them. Most often, we follow the impulses of desire, and we do so unwillingly, whether there is a healthy consistency to those impulses or not. I have desires that are not healthy for me. I get better about not giving in to them, though. Like many other things, discipline and control are relative matters. I've never yet seen any individual who is in complete control. Someone that has absolute self-control. I've never seen that. Even in very remarkable people, there's only a small degree of self-control, and they even stand out at that. We don't even know what our self is. We're just beginning to wake up. So we have a long way to go before waking up to ourselves, to say nothing of disciplining ourselves. When it comes to controlling others, there are a lot of ethical issues in that, whether it should be done, and how, and why. It's a difficult matter, but we're even more feeble in our ability to control others. Probably by now you've figured out that there's something uncomfortable about the way that we're speaking about discipline and control. We're speaking about them as if they were static things and that they were finite things. That you get control and that's it, you're in control. And that there is an end, that you can get to the end, and when you reach that finite end, you're in control of everything. We're talking about actually being able to do that and be permanent about it. Now, it's usually true that when we do get control of one aspect of our life, we keep it. We don't lose it. But that doesn't mean that is the end of the matter, even for that particular aspect. All of this is because we, I believe, misunderstand Pluto, as we misunderstand all of the spiritual planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. They are transcendent planets, and they represent states of being and kinds of consciousness that we're really not very much aware of. These planets just point at something, at states of consciousness that have no beginning and that have no end. All of these states are so abstract, they're so lofty, that they are, for the most part, beyond ideas. And when we use ideas, as we're going to try to do it tonight, we're only reflecting true being, because we have no language or no way of grasping the true meaning. We only get reflective ideas about it. Even at that, what we're trying to do is impossible. As impossible as squaring a circle. However, we can approximate squaring a circle. Tribe can tell us that squaring a circle is finding a circle that has the same area, a square that has the same area as a circle. And the way you do is you start with the square, and you say that's way too small. Or you take one that's on the outside, and you take the average, and you get fairly close. If that doesn't work well enough, So you start all over again. Instead of using a circle, you use a pentagon. The pieces are smaller, and your approximation is closer. And pretty soon you're up to a hexagon, and then a septagon, and an octagon, and then an emagon. And the more sides you get that you can measure, the closer you get. And so what we're going to do is at least try to get some approximate idea of what Pluto is all about. In the dense physical world, in the solar system in which we live and which we study with astronomy, Pluto is the most distant planet from the Sun. Each of the planets that is outside of Saturn, that is Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, represents a different kind of a state of transcendent spiritual consciousness. Saturn is the gatekeeper, and anything that's inside of Saturn is concrete, very definite. But everything that is beyond is something that's universal, transcendent. If we work from the realm of concrete experience upward into transcendental realms, the first realm is called the realm of human spirit. The second is called life spirit, and the third is called divine spirit. Put together, their representation or their representatives form the triune Godhead. That is, Jehovah or the Holy Ghost represents the human spirit, the Son or the cosmic being Christ, which is not Jesus, represents the life spirit, and the being that we know as the Father represents the divine spirit. The only representatives, the spirits themselves or the spiritual states themselves, are the spiritual reality. So, the Godhead is a unity in Trinity and a Trinity in unity. Without getting into too much mathematics, the easiest way to define all of space in n dimensions, the simplest object, is a plane triangle. It defines all of space. And that represents whatever's inside that triangle is objectified, and that objectification is representative of all of space, including what is outside of it. The region of human spirit is also called the region of abstract thought. And in its being composed of universal ideas, it is ruled by Jupiter. In its being the focus of the centralmost idea, the idea of self, and the idea of God, and the idea of self as God, it is represented by the Sun. But in its state of spirituality, the spiritual essence of that region, it is ruled by Neptune. Because all of those ideas are tied together by the general notion of abstraction. And so all of the ideas about anything and everything are present all at the same time. That's why this realm is sometimes called the realm of chaos. And Neptune is a planet of dealing with chaos. The intuition of Neptune is an intuition that you know that something is true and you know why it's true. Because you can make a connection between two or more ideas. So everything is connected to the Neptunian consciousness. sounds like anything but an astrology class tonight, but that's, to get started, we have to deal with that. The realm of life spirit transcends even ideas. That means we can't talk about it. It's beyond ideas that we use to reflect it. Sometimes it's called a void, since it's void of any idea that we would use to describe or explain or to name it. Sometimes it's called a lost word, like the lost word of Freemasonry, for example. It's so unified and total and close in spirit that it is experienced as love. Everything in love and loving everything all at the same time. It is so awake that it is seen as pure, intelligible light, like the light that you get when you know the truth, only it's like that all the time. Only infinitely deep, boundlessly universal. It is so conscious that its consciousness is not separable into self and not self. It's the selfness of all the different foci that we call selves. So when you experience the Uranus intuition, you know that something is true, and you feel it with your heart, and there's no doubt about it, and you just do it. There's no need for explanation or anything like that. Transcending life spirit is divine spirit. And the mystics who are capable of going to these depths claim that divine spirit is the highest realm to which humans like ourselves can attain waking consciousness. The light that is the life spirit that creates the ideas is called pure imagination. But the will that lights the light and causes that imagining to create imaginations is called the divine masculine, the divine spirit, the Father. So the light spirit is the cosmic feminine, and the divine spirit is the cosmic masculine. Since it transcends even the love of life spirit, it's so subtle that it seems to us as though it is feelingless. Since it transcends the light of truth, or of love wisdom, it seems as though it's absolute to us. And it comes from such a deep place, beyond that which we call truth, that it even seems arbitrary. And since it transcends even selfness, it's genderless, and it almost seems characterless. This is ultimate subtlety. The realms that go beyond divine spirit do not participate in the evolutionary creation to which we belong. For this reason, everything occurs within divine spirit. And with our earthly language and our earthly conceiving of things, that makes divine spirit seem totalitarian. Now, with that kind of brief introduction, we can begin to understand, at least indirectly, the kind of consciousness that is pointed at by Pluto, which, like all of the octaves, is very often a misunderstood planet. In fascist Plutonian consciousness, one disciplines oneself absolutely. Normally we discipline ourselves to have self-control. And with that self-control we can do things. Or we can live better. Or we can free ourselves from things that keep us enslaved. Whether it is rightly applied or wrongly applied, with the fascistic Plutonian consciousness, the discipline becomes an end in itself. That is the function of the divine spirit. It wills things into existence. Thus, power becomes an end in itself, not just something that facilitates everything else or anything else. It seems static to us because this is the end. Like this is all there is. And this is above everything that changes within it. It's so subtle, it doesn't give itself into the light. It keeps its power by never coming out of its subtlety. So to speak, it is reserved, or it is always withdrawn, and for that reason it is always powerful. We best see it in various different kinds of Plutonian states. Pluto rules Scorpio, and that is the ultimate hot-cold sexual function. Even in extremity, we see Pluto. For example, in syphilis, when one gets into the latter states of syphilis, one gets a perfect example in history with Friedrich Nietzsche. He says there is no God, because if there were a God, I were it. In a way, he's right, but he was thinking of himself as that power. It's called megalomania. When you seek power, and you have power, and you believe that you are power. But the megalomania that is in syphilis is not really truly Plutonian. It has all the power qualities, but there's a loss of control, and a lot of it is lost to rage, which is another Plutonian quality. So, in our existence here, we are very far, metaphorically speaking, from divine spirit. And we as humans are only beginning to respond to divine spirit and express will. So when we look at it in charts like Mishima, which is a very rare chart, I don't have any handouts. The computer was broken, so I couldn't make any fact sheets, and I couldn't give the written part. That'll have to come next time. But you all have your data sheets for Mishima, and Pluto is the strongest planet in the chart. That is very, very rare. All right, now let's start looking a little bit into Mishima. We'll get into him now. Mars, which rules Aries, the sign on the ascendant, is the lower octave of Pluto. In music, octavation means the same tonal quality on a higher and a lower level. Astrological octavation is a little bit different. A higher and the lower octaves are related in some of their same central characteristics, but they are definitely not the same thing on different levels. For example, Uranus and Venus are octaves. Both are planets of love. But Venus is possessive love. The possessive love of Taurus, which likes to own things. Whereas Uranus is altruistic love, like of Aquarius. And it doesn't want to own anything. It just as soon give everything away. It wins by losing. Mercury and Neptune are both planets of knowledge. But Mercury is factual knowledge, data. The knowledge of Neptune is not so easy to pin down. It's a spiritual knowing of the truth at the heart of something. Mars and Pluto, which are octaves, have to do with the capacity to do things. But each one functions quite differently. Mars does things by direct action. It's a kinetic planet. It is a doing planet. In this chart, Mars rules the ascendant, and it is in Aries, but it's in the 12th house. Pluto never weakens itself by any kind of direct action. It works indirectly by will. It holds its will until something is accomplished. It intends something to happen until it is accomplished. At most, everything is pervaded by its power. Sometimes the negative pole of Pluto works as a fate. It fates things into being. So looking at the Mishima character, Mars and Aries rising indicates a personality that's driven to action. Even if it means pacing the floor. It isn't a nervous pacing of the floor, it's an energetic pacing of the floor. In this chart, the Sun in Capricorn in the 10th house wants action to some end, but as far as Mars is concerned, as long as there's action, that's enough. So in this respect, Mishima is very Aryan, in that for him, the more action there was, the better. He loved vigorous exercise. He liked to do things to make himself sweat. This is a book that Jack has lent to the class, and I have it marked with pictures. And there are a lot of pictures of Mishima at different stages of his life and in different activities. I'm sure you've all got the chart. Henry doesn't have a chart. I don't think I'm going to need the chart for this, so I'll let you look at mine. Chart we're looking mostly at the ascendant, and we're going to look a lot at the Mars ruler of the ascendant squaring Pluto. Most of the night. Even though he was a kinetic personality, he just didn't whittle away his energy in action. He was martial in another way. He was an activist. The forms of activism were martial, and he was attracted to the traditional martial arts and the philosophy behind them. Action and activism are obviously for the purpose of changing things.
However, when you change things, not all changing is progressive and forward-looking. Mishima looked backwards. Mars is in the 12th house to begin with, which is a looking backward. When he looked back, he didn't look back with nostalgia. And he didn't look back exclusively in tradition. Well, the Capricorn side of him liked to look at tradition. He would say he was forward-looking, but in his strict disciplinarian Mars-Pluto nature, he felt a drive to be free, and for the Japanese people to be free, and he disliked all of the decadence around him. Talking about in the 60s and 70s when Japan is very, very wealthy. He was forward-looking, but he would say something like, Japan cannot really go forward without backtracking. It would have to backtrack and to go to the point where it went astray, and you sometimes have to do that. That's a reality. I at one time was in Canyonlands National Park, and they have trails that you can't see the trail. You have to look at cairns, which are little piles of stone. And it seems like you're going there, but unless you look at when you're at one cairn, you have to be able to see the next one to know where you're going. And I made some great errors, and I got way off, and I had to go back to the last cairn that I was at. And from there, keep looking all around until I saw the next cairn, and then it would go right. So something like that is what Mishima was saying. He said, we've gone wrong here. And for Mishima, the point at which Japan deviated from its destiny and from the character of the Japanese people was when it ceased to have an army. There's some reason for that. Any political scientist will tell you that one of the definitions of sovereignty is the ability to defend the borders. If you can't defend your borders and people won't respect it, you're not a sovereign nation. But it was much more than that. It was something much more difficult for Mishima. At this point, Japan was forbidden by the terms of surrender in the Second World War. It was forbidden to have an army. Only a token army could it have. And since it didn't have to spend a lot of money on defense, it was able to subsidize its businesses. And it became very, very prosperous. But with that prosperity, it lost what Mishima thought was the essential character of the Japanese people, which for him, with Aries rising, looking at the external world, was a martial nature. He was thinking that it was just decadent bankers and people who were defenseless, but were sold out to consumerism and pleasure and things like that. So he related his personal philosophy directly to the external world. He believed that an individual had to be physically fit and ready and willing and able to defend oneself. He thought a country had to be the same way. You can see that the ascendant and what he saw for the country was the same thing. In this respect, he practiced what he preached. He had a very strict regimen. And that regimen is another example of the Mars-Pluto discipline to having power. He was strong on exercise. He practiced martial arts. In some respects, this was mysterious, and it was even religious. And the religious quality of it is indicated by the fact that Mars is trine to Neptune. And that aspect usually indicates a perfected fusion between spirituality and energy. Mishima was not spiritual. He had something like a spiritual charisma. He was able to carry that in his expressions, which is why he was so popular with his writing. He even acted in plays. He was even an actor in movies. He knew that ritual galvanized the energy in people. So his personality, the Mars being involved with both Pluto and Neptune, carried some kind of a strange aura about it. In some ways, his body, if you look at some of those pictures, it exudes energy. It was someone who was charismatic, as though from another place, in another realm. And this shows him to be almost a fervent man. In some ways a little bit dangerous. Now from this departure, things get a little bit strange. Mishima was something of a physical homosexual. And the word physical homosexual requires a good deal of explanation, so we go out on another exegesis to get at it. From a viewpoint of mysticism, there are various varieties of homosexuality and many different kinds of antecedent causes for them. This is true even of just male homosexuality. Astrologically speaking, there are numerous causes for homosexuality. Now, Mishima did not have the most common astrological patterns for homosexuality, so we'll have to look at a special kind of homosexuality that he had, and we'll have to look at him in that regard. Before anything else, we must say that he was at least bisexual, not purely homosexual. He was married and had children, as you can see from the pictures. He loved his wife very dearly. He was very tender with her. He was already quite wealthy and famous when he married her. And when they married, he took her on a trip all the way around the world. It's quite a nice thing. In one way of looking at it, homosexuality is a matter of polarity. Our dense physical bodies are gendered male and female so that we can cooperatively procreate with part of our energy while using the rest for creation and spiritual evolution. Now this polarization does not end with the physical body. It penetrates a little bit into our inner natures. So we are externally polarized into male and female bodies. The internal polarization is between the dense physical body and the inner etheric body, such that if the outer body is male, the inner body in the etheric is going to be female. This is why men having the polarization in the dense physical are great at bursts of energy or bursts of strength, overpower. But females who are, or those who are involved in female bodies, are positive inward light, so they can make babies. Even if we could put a womb in a male could not make babies because he doesn't have the polarized etheric body to do it. And because the positive etheric body is what sustains the physical body, this is why women live longer. And in all feats of endurance, they may not have the burst of strength that men do, but in feats of endurance, women always outperform men. The etheric body is our interface with the higher vehicles and with the spirit itself. This is why the soul is sometimes called by the opposite of the physical, where men, the spiritual ideal of the soul is the divine princess. Or in the fairy tales, the young girl looks for the prince that comes from heaven. If we look for complementation externally, as we must do if we want to continue the species, we often externally see what is internalized in ourselves. So what we are not always aware of in that inner feminine for males or the inner masculine for females, we find that in someone outside of ourselves. This is the basis of romance and a lot of other things that get blown out of proportion. The divine bride or the divine bloom that we are seeking from heaven, we see outside of ourselves, and that gets to be a little too excessive. Now, normally in most people, there's a balanced and a fairly conventional polarization in the inner and the outer. That balance is constantly shifting. During the course of a lifetime, by the soul actions that we do, the service we perform, perception we do, we build up the soul ethers of our inner vital bodies, and they become stronger. Thus, old men become sort of sweetly feminine. And old women become much more determined, much more assertive about life. Now, normally, in between lives, the gains that we've made in a given life gets assimilated, and then when we come out of the next life, we come out with the balance reestablished. But sometimes the imbalance is so strong and it's so sustained that it can't be immediately corrected. We hang on so hard so that you might say the soul loses its pliability. Character has developed rigidly and excessively in one kind of polarization. When that occurs, one becomes a transsexual or homosexual or something of that nature. Sometimes, if a person is very developed in both the inward and the outward, and there isn't some kind of obsessive grabbing for one gender or another, then a person becomes very balanced. They become a cosmic androgyne, a male-female person. Eventually, when we all evolve this far, and we have the ability to truly create with the sexual energy, there will be no necessity for sex anymore. And we'll create in a different way, and sex will be obsolete. And then we won't have that polarization and the danger that can come from that kind of polarization. Now, since the vital body works both magnetically in the physical body, so to speak, magnetically, and directly, it works directly into the physical body through hormones. So that what happens in the vital body, the etheric body, works right into the physical body. So that if we get the polarization messed up, it gets right into the glands and the physical body follows form. In our lives, we're much more affected by hormones than we think. We're much less affected by our higher spiritual vehicles than we think. So it's not surprising then that some people who have polarized themselves extremely for a long time and have hung on to that attitude are actually even physically with those characteristics. They usually feel they were born that way, and there's nothing they can do about it. And if you're a materialist, and that this is all there is, it's easy to see that logic. It is very hard to do something about it, because it's something that is often deeply ingrained and it's tied up with our pleasure, and it's tied up with our whole self-image. So it's hard to make a change. However, if it were permanent, and rebirth is a true fact, everybody would eventually become homosexual. You see what I mean? Because once you got off on that path and it was a permanent state for all of your future lives, then anybody coming into the stream, there would be progressively more and more homosexuals and less breeders. This is what they call us. You see what I'm saying? That it is not permanent. Somewhere along the line, everyone changes. From all of the above, we can conclude that there are various ways that one can become homosexual. And there's a spectrum between the extremes and the stereotypes. We'll look at the stereotypes because they're important to get at what we're trying to get at. In females, if the outer physical dominates to the degree that it affects the polarization of the vital body, then one is feminine inwardly and outwardly. In such an individual, it's sometimes called a femme. And I believe I'm not too much off the spirit of the times there. I believe they're called lipstick lesbians. If the inner etheric vehicle dominates and works its way into the physical so that it seems as if the physical and the etheric are both masculine, then we have what used to be called a butch or a bull dyke or whatever that. In males, when the inner vital body is dominant, it's what we call a swish or a fag. If the outer masculine dominates, one has the weightlifter tough guy. Now we see a case, it doesn't mean that all it means is in all cases, but now we see when we look at Mishima with very masculine Aries rising, and Mars in Aries in the 12th house, we see what has happened in him. To some extent, he was born that way. He has a book called Confessions of a Mask, which is semi-autobiographical, and it tells about his childhood. And he developed that way in reaction to his upbringing. Now, in some cases, I've seen a few charts where homosexuals have developed in reaction to a dominant mother. And that very often produces usually more effeminate homosexuals. That's not quite the case, even though Mishima has a very strong house. In his case, it was the grandmother that was very, very strong. The grandmother effectively kidnapped him. And she raised him on her own according to the traditional ways, and his real mother could only every now and then visit him by appointment. It's strange. Japanese culture is really difficult. Not only that, she raised him as a girl. He wore dresses and female clothing when he was a child. He excelled in education, but he recoiled and he rebelled from his upbringing, even though he was well educated. He took the education, but he didn't take the form that his grandmother tried to give to her, but instead he rebelled, which is the Mars-Pluto kind of rebellion. So when he got free from her, which is all going to be talked about in the written part, I'm going to get the handout ready for that. I'll try to do something different in each of the two. When he got free from his grandmother, he reacted and he became hyper-masculine. In fact, he was a weightlifter. Now, even though he has this characteristic, and we can understand it astrologically, he was different. He was different about everything. He was so individual. It's hard to put him in a class of any kind. In his philosophy toward the world, which was, as we saw, extremely martial, and his homosexuality, he was much more like the Greeks of the ancient times than like the Romans or like the Persians. The Romans, when they practiced homosexuality, they did it out of boredom. They were seeking different pleasures, different experiences, and they knew that the mixing together of sexual organs in different ways produced different kinds of thrills. They had nothing better to do. Persian culture was in its prime in the age of Taurus, and it had a distinctly Venusian flavor. So the homosexuality there had to do with luxuriance and richness and decadence. This early Persia was extremely masculine, but when it came into its own and it was an old society, it became very feminine. Greek civilization and Greek culture came into its own in the age of Aries. Consequently, it had very bold, masculine, dominated cultural values. Women were not looked on well at all. They were seen as necessary for childbearing. They could never be taken for an ideal. They really do now. Men looked to other men for ideals, and then they got things all confused and they became physical about something that was supposed to be a philosophical idealism. Now, Mishima loved his wife, got on famously with her, and with a lot of very outstanding women in Japanese society. He had very strong masculine ideals and very strong masculine friends. Now, hypermasculinity does not always lead to homosexuality. In fact, in most cases it does not. I don't know exactly what's involved. I think it has to do with being hypermasculine and fighting with the sex force that has something to do with it. But I can't say that as a matter of fact because I don't have enough experience and I don't have enough vision to be able to tell that. In any case, his hypermasculinity took as homosexuality. Now, in some things, especially with Mishima, when something like this takes, the results are really bizarre. When you start directly meddling with the sexual energy, and when you're not led by love, you can get yourself into all kinds of trouble, especially if you're not guided by a very experienced spiritual teacher. Sexual energy is not just neutral energy. It is the essence of all things spiritual. Co-ruling Scorpio, Mars and Pluto have to do with the most basic nature of sexual energy. Mars tries to be just pure energy with no favoritism of any kind. Energy's energy. Pluto tries to be clothed and above it all in pure power and with no favorites of any kind. However, they each do have character, especially in the manifestations of them. Mars does like uniforms, and Pluto does like being dictatorial, like the underworld godfather, who's very Plutonian. Underworld godfather never gives an order. He rules by threat and by influence. So when Mars and Pluto are activated, and are activated malefically, as with this square, their worst comes out. And the worst goes well beyond fascist control. The worst is involved physically in this case with Mars, psychologically with Pluto. Mishima was keenly interested in active and sadomasochism. He appears to have been more interested in the receiving end of it, but it would be incorrect to say that he was a masochist because he was way too martial and way too dominant for that. And it would also be incorrect to say that he was only interested in the pain and the control of the pain with his Mars-Pluto nature. Well, that was part of it. He was interested in the ritual aspects of it, but in a strange, dark way. Pluto it's for some unknown dark reason why things are done. In the book Confessions of a Mask, he describes his first orgasm and ejaculation in masturbation. And it occurs when he's looking through his father's library, and he looks at the painting of the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. If you look at the book, there is a photographic reenactment where he reenacts that painting. He has arrows sticking in his body with blood running down. Now, the very strange thing, after I read the book, within a month after I had read that section of the book, Confessions of a Mass, I went to see the glory of Polish art in the post-Renaissance, or in the late Renaissance. There was the painting. I turned around the corner of Milwaukee Art Museum and I said, wow, there it was right in front of my eyes.
So, but he was so captivated by somebody being tortured, being martyred, that was ultimately exciting to him. So you can see that there's some kind of a Mars, sometimes in sadism, like you just really want to give it to somebody else. For him, he's so Mars-Pluto neutral, he's willing to give it, but he's also willing to take it. It's sort of like there's some ultimate power in receiving pain. And it's a very dark kind of thing. Aries is the rising sign, and Mars in Aries in the east point to a vigorous assertion of new life, like in spring. He's eager to actually change society, even martially if he has to. He's a true Mars Aries person because he doesn't really have an enemy. He doesn't even think the United States is an enemy. He just wants to have an active, changing military to have it out and have a change. But then the Mars square Pluto comes in, and Mars and Pluto are at cross purposes. And even with the really strong evolutionary adjustment that we use, Pluto is the strongest planet in the chart. Most likely the ruler. In this case, as in a lot of cases, Pluto represents death wish. As much as he loves life and the vigor of life, youthful, assertive, even violent life, he thinks death is greater than life. Everything that lives dies, so death is master of all. So you can see he wants to give himself philosophically, actively, to death. The ultimate fascist power is discipline or control. So he wants to control his death, his own death. Especially in his poetry and in his more poetic writings, he puts forth the idea, and it's an idea that comes from the old samurai tradition, that the ultimate act of an artist is death, how he dies. All of life is, for an artist, to be an epitome. One acts out one's life as an art. But all of that is just a rehearsal for the perfectly ultimate act. I came across the album to listen to this. We're appreciating all kinds of different characters, and this is a very different one. Now, there's really some Capricornian and Plutonian elitism in this, because not everybody can die poetically or in ritual. But he's too preoccupied to really address that. He wrote a lot of books on reincarnation, but he didn't believe in it. He didn't believe in it in anything but a physical way. He used it as a literary ploy. In an eager Aries kind of way, he's much too preoccupied with present reality and his departure from it to even care where he's ultimately going. So it's not looking at death as some ultimate purpose where you're going to some great heaven and a different way.
All he knows is fighting for life and preparing to die in a glorious way that is the ultimate of that fight. Now, not a great deal is known about not a great deal of detail is known about his homosexual life. There are a few statements here and there from him and a little bit in his writings. But he did associate with more fiercely proud, fascistic young men as his life went on. And his association with them was Greek-like. There was co-admiration between him and the young men, and one doesn't know how far things went beyond that. He was martial in his personality so much that he liked sensational literature. But one would certainly expect of him that he would find sex too weakening and too liable to leading one to decadence. So this is probably not someone that was sexually excessive at all. In that regard, he's probably really close to the Greeks. So he had to have all of that energy in order to die, and to die right. What kind of thing is this? All of this together with other facts and an attempted or intentional positive polarization of the physical and etheric bodies is pointed to with the Mars-Aries consciousness. The Mars square with Pluto shows extreme discipline in bodybuilding, martial arts, in all areas of his life. He forced himself to write so and so many hours per day. He was rigorous about it. All of these things, all of the martial qualities would indicate that there was probably a higher than normal secretion of androgen. And probably even a higher steroid count would be indicated. So when you think about this, if you looked at this the way material science would look right now, which only goes to the chemical stuff, that would go right along with the personality. Because if steroids are high, there's a tendency to cruelty. So the Mars, Aries, and Pluto all point to cruelty as well as the willingness to bear great pain.
Would that be Pluto and Cancer?
That could be. Yes. I didn't come to any final decision about it, so there's nothing in the notes. In fact, this is a class where most of the notes are not in notes. Only saying some of the things, and I had to pass them out. I didn't feel sound in the ground with them. The Aries component, by nature, is not inclined toward guilt. So the obsessive tendencies of the Mars square Pluto have to be placed somewhere else in guilt. So they go into the quest for ultimate control. And the discipline is not to get control to live right, but to die right. So it seems like Pluto, representing the divine spirit, is the ultimate arbitrator of all cosmos, and it demonstrates its power by overcoming even the will to live. But it is ultimate source of life and death, so it is the ultimate source of the will to live. So you can see that in Pluto and Scorpio there is a kind of inner darkness and a kind of self-destructiveness. And that in the timeless quality of the divine spirit, when one looks at Pluto kind of consciousness, one focuses on inner darkness and it will do its full creation which is in some way like a gigantic splendid orgasm as a creation, but it's ultimately to sink back into the darkness of its own unknown, which is probably where everything came from in the first place, ever unknown, absolute, behind it all. Very interesting psychology that he's working on. So he senses the dark, ultimate power of things. We don't have time to go into it, but the most beautiful aspect of this chart is one that's extremely dark, and that's the very strong trine of Saturn and Pluto. Somewhere along the line, when we come to this chart, we left time to look at that. It's really strong. It's not a matter, we can see then, that his will to live was weak. He did smoke, but his health and his fitness were good. As a child, he was weak. He had tuberculosis. His recovery had to do with his will to live. This is out of the written part, but when Mars progressed out of the 12th house, and it was no longer sickly, and that's when he got free from Grandma, he took off on his own, and that's when he became very strong. If you look at the photos, you can see that when he's wearing suits, he likes snug-fitting suits. There are a lot of photos of him in exercise or martial arts clothes. And a number of them show him in a military uniform. Now, all of these clearly show a very martial personality. The martial bent in his nature carries into his associations and his interactions with the external world and the environment. He actually maintained his own private army. He made enough money from selling so many books and having famous plays and such so on that he could afford to keep an army. He did his own recruiting, and in order to get into the army, the young men had to agree with his fascist philosophy in order to get in. They had uniforms, they had arms. If I'm not mistaken, I think the uniforms were orange. A strong color. They actually even held maneuvers. They held maneuvers with the regular Japanese army in the snow and everything else. He loved the discipline, and he himself was more disciplined than the members of his army, even though he was much older than all of them. So let's take a little bit here now and look in a little bit more analytical way at Mars squared Pluto. Mars is the number 4 planet at 120 and 15%. The square is the number 4 aspect, but it has only 41 points. But it controls 10% of the aspect strength. Pluto is the number 1 planet, and it's at number 137, and an approximation number, and it's a planet and a half, and it has 15%. So what we have here are 2 strong planets in a moderate aspect. And there are several things that we haven't seen before. One is that even though Mars is number 4 and Pluto is number 1, Mars isn't greatly outpowered by Pluto. And that's because so many of the planets at the top are of fairly even strength. You've got all of your approximation notes. I'll have to give you a whole set of all of that. Okay. This in turn means that there is a balance in the ratio between the number of aspects and the strength of the aspects. Meaning to say that if all of the planets are of fairly even strength, they either have all the same aspects, but that is not possible unless they're all in one lump. But the one thing that you can find universally is that they must have a balance in the ratio of the number of aspects to the strengths of the aspects. So there's an analogy that works with sports. If a team is balanced and it has only average players, it is usually stronger than a team that has one or two stars but a bunch of weak players. A balanced team doesn't have obvious weak points. A balanced team has several ways to win, and it's likely to use any and all of them. If it weren't for the glaring weakness of Neptune being so weak, this would be an extremely solid, compact character with no planet being especially weak. The other thing we haven't seen is with the aspect itself. It has an estimation rating of 41, which is less than the average rating. If you look at all of the aspects and all the charts that we have, it's significantly less than the average rating. Yet, because there are so few aspects, and most of the aspects are below the aspect mean, the aspect has a 10% rating, even at being that weak. So what we're saying is that there are no super strong talents in him. So this does the same thing, or reinforces the whole idea of the balance of medium strength planets. This means that you have a medium to moderate strength tool that is called on much more than usual. Normally, if you have a great talent, you call on that all the time. Here we have a medium strength or a moderate strength planet that's called on a lot. Now, in some ways, this is hard to understand. In literary things, he was brilliant, especially fine arts things. We'll come to that in another talk. It has to do with the Mars and Venus being the strongest aspect. In the Mars-Pluto things, he was hardly brilliant. He wasn't talented in athletics or in tactics or even in strength. Yet, he persevered in them. He pursued them all of his life. That's a rather heartening thing to see. It's really heartening to see somebody that plugs away at something that doesn't come easy and at something at which he probably never will excel. And it just goes to show you how the obsessive quality of the afflicted Pluto keeps on. It won't give up. It doesn't look like there's a lot of hope. This also shows something about the Mars-Aries expression. Normally Mars and Aries are highly competitive. Mishima was not competitive. He was martial, and he loved exhilarating in the field of energy, but he was content to do the martial things without having to win or to even compete. He was obsessive about the art of perfect living and perfect dying, but that was enough to do without having to best others in the process. See, this is a real individualism that isn't an insecure individualism. You do your individual best, and that doesn't make anybody else look bad or anything like that. It's just that you're doing your thing. He would like to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was nominated a number of times. That had more to do with Capricorn honor-seeking and it had to do with competitiveness. I don't know if all of this is due to the balance and the internal teamwork, but I tend to think so. I think that having that kind of quality is very healthy. With the planets strong, that is, Mars and Pluto being strong, and the aspect not so strong, it's sort of like two warriors trying to do battle with each other, but unable to connect enough to have a real battle. Hence, in all things, he never had a really satisfying test or a really satisfying trial. And may have something to do with the fact why there isn't any competition like that. Not an attraction for it. So the key words for Mars versus Pluto. Mars is energy, Pluto is power. Mars is active desire, Pluto is potential desire. Mars is free flow, Pluto is restraint or control. Mars is hot, Pluto is cold. Mars is direct application, Pluto is influence or threat. Blending those kinds of things together, you get a feel discipline energy, control, and direction. If you think about it, Mars can never be stopped down. You just can't stop energy. You can compress it and compress it, you can't fill it out. By the same token, it's impossible for Pluto to quit. It's impossible for it to give up control. So from the desire aspect, we get the sense of demand. But because the ascendant is involved in this, it's a personal demand. And not external, except with his private army. So he's a really strong personal demand of himself. If aspects between Mars and Pluto are benefic, they're much less obsessive, much less facetious and demanding. This is because there's usually a healthy stance for exercise, and the controlled flow of accomplishment takes away from any pressure. In my chart I have Mars sextile Pluto. And over the long run, discipline and control in my life do become stronger, and I don't have to be real extreme about that. With the malefic aspects between Mars and Pluto, there's always a struggle, and the discipline and control is very severe. It's almost desperate, because the quality about it can be so excruciating. You're hurt because you want to control. Even the resultant rage, if one doesn't carry it out, is painful. You should not ever do that positive rage. When Pluto is stronger in an aspect between Mars and Pluto, one is almost will-bound, and the control is so dark and so heavy-handed that it is almost suffocating. It's almost deathly in suffocation. And when Pluto is stronger, there's too much likelihood to guilt as the driving force for the control. The desperation comes in that way. It can be like putting a lid on something for which there should be transmutation. But with denial of the active change, that's when Mars is stronger, there is a defiant attitude in the Mars-Pluto aspects, especially the malefics like this one. It's something like appealing power to back up your action. It's like learning karate to kick the shit out of other people. It's that kind of thing. The Mars sassiness comes out. Personally, in all aspects, I like balanced planetary strengths. Even if the aspect is malefic, I like balance. It's too hard to do something with character if there's a really egregious imbalance. You know, it's like walking on a railroad track and carrying a bowling ball up with one arm. You just can't do it. It's not easy. In this case, Mishima is fortunate because he does have balance. This is not just a balancing of two qualities like 2 points. It has to do with the balance between releasing versus compressing or restraining. It's dangerous to either bottle things up too much or to release without restraint. So this is the balance in this, even though it's a malefic, it's pleasant. Squares always mean blocks, and even though there are blocks about the right use of energy, such as sadomasochism, it is expressed, and there is some control. It's not repressively fascist. But there is fascism, as we have seen, and we'll see a little more. Now, there's one major quality for each Mars and Aries and Pluto that we have not examined. Mars and Aries are the planet and sign of youth. In the written parallel, which you will eventually get at some time, much of the timing is mentioned. For now, it's just sufficient to say that as life progressed, he came more into his Mars-Aries personality. And he was more associated with more and more young men. It's not because he wanted to play the Capricorn grand old man, or that he wanted to boss people around, or it was probably a little bit of both. It was not because he became more accepting of his homosexuality and wanted handsome, desirable young men around, though there was some of that. It was because he had a personal philosophy that esteemed youth. He knew that the body in the person was in its prime around 28. He was so much into his body in physical exercise that he wanted to be with it physically as much as possible. So he worked extremely hard to be fit, and he was comparably fit to the young people, even though he was a good deal older. He was so much into the personal poetic philosophy of youth that he believed that the perfect poetic death, which was so important to him, was to die young. That you should die heroically and you should die young. You should die gloriously and beautifully in the service of the nation. You should die young. That brings us to the Pluto side, the thing we haven't spoken of. When we spoke of Pluto as representing the divine spirit, we intimated that it was dark, invisible, and all-powerful in its spiritual being, and that it never weakened its potency by direct manifestation or action of any kind. We mentioned it in illustration with the Godfather just a few minutes ago, the influencer from the underworld. It works just as well or better as the hidden or divine Father. In Christianity, the Father is never seen or never known. In Hinduism, Brahma, who is the first of the Trinity, has no open religion. There are Vaishvas, and I don't know how to say the word for Shivites. but there are none for brown. So the heroes in all mythology and in all folklore, the heroes and heroines have divine fathers that they never see. So this principle is throughout nature. The idea is that the subtle influence, the more subtle and more hidden and more dark it is, the more powerful it is. Mars is obviously dramatic. It's flashy. Pluto is the all-powerful discipliner and it's the controller. When this principle is carried by Mishima to the nth degree, death is more powerful than life. Because in his materialism, death is an unknown. It works into his personal philosophy in a different way. Planets are people. And every planet represents one or more people. And for Mishima, Pluto was the emperor. Whether the emperor wanted it or not. Because after World War II, the emperor, by terms of surrender, had to be only the figurehead. After the atomic bomb and what it did to the Japanese people, the emperor didn't want to be anything but a figurehead. He probably cringed at the idea that Mishima and his army pledged their allegiance to serve the emperor. In mythology, the emperors were descendants of the sun. This didn't bother Father Mishima in the least. He didn't have to meet the emperor. Mishima, the reverting to the rule by the emperor with the divine ancestry was essential to a happy Japan. Japanese had to have a national army from the martial side, and they had to serve the emperor from the feudal side. It doesn't bother him that there never was a national army until World War II, because they came out of the feudal state into the Industrial Revolution. When you have somebody that's a fundamentalist fanatic like that, they're always trying to go back to a past that never existed before. It doesn't make any difference that what he wanted to go back to wasn't there. So the attitudes like this are other manifestations of understanding the divine spirit is the ultimate source of life, the ultimate goal of life and death. Ultimately, it was the emperor that was his Pluto figure. Mishima, in his Plutonian consciousness, recognized power, potential of the emperor, and the more shadowy connections and the connection between the emperor, the more powerful it was. It was irrational. But power, irrationality, the Mars figure in Mishima's life was Masakatsu Oruta. There are pictures of him in there. He's young, beautiful. Mishima perfectly describes him, high on cheeks. If you look at him, it's really got a round-faced vibe to him. He was the next in command in Mishima in the army, which was called the Takanakai, the Mishima army. They loved each other as men and as warriors, perhaps as lovers. As time progressed, they spent more and more time together, usually discussing army matters. They shared a common philosophy, and they planned their strategy. Mishima has the sun in Capricorn, and so he is very time conscious. In his fascistic view of things, the country was becoming more decadent by the day. And looking at himself in the mirror, he could see that he was growing older every day. And the poetic view of old is to die young. And one does not die by aging or death. So the life and death struggle eventually they planned and carried out the now famous raid military in Japan. They took control of the office of General Yamazaki, in charge of the army, and they took control of him. They demanded an assembly parade on the parade ground. And when the army was assembled, Mishima went out on the balcony and he spoke to the army. He urged them to follow their allegiance to the emperor, and he urged patriotism in them. They didn't hear him because they were almost unhearable. They didn't even care what he had to say. They were eventually jeering at him. Trouble became worse and worse and intelligent and everything else. So he and Marika jumped from the balcony and went back into the building. And this is had a sacred night, very hard, but he committed ritual hard, and he did it pledging to the emperor, and he jabbed the knife into his intestines and ripped across his body. And then Marika, who was the next in command, it was his duty to take the ancient samurai sword and lop his head off. And so he would go with the sword, and he was so broken up, he struck times, and instead of the back, and there were huge cuts in the back, and he was spitting blood. It was enormous pain, and eventually one of the other soldiers who was skilled with swordsmanship got the sword and slit the head. And Marika was supposed to commit hard, and he got the ritual dagger. He didn't, and the young man had enough strength to put it into his body, and all he did was put a wound that was double that was a skin muscle that he gave him the history of himself. And then the same guy came and that was the end of it all. Not necessarily. So despite all of the planning, and all of the practice, and all of the discipline, and all of the control, it wasn't poetic. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't effective. Either the speech or the ritual suicide. Anything because they didn't get it. They weren't in the soul of that. So there was something in all of that that didn't last through to sort of in his own world of discipline. So it comes right back to the same thing in a different way. All people who do exercise do more exercise. And so it didn't have any effect. It was a complete box job. You expect with Mars, correct? You know, expect would be easy poetic. That's all it got. I have more.
I do have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that Mars has no favorite and Pluto has no favorite.
Neither of them like to have favorites. They sometimes do.
My favorites mean what?
Just as Venus likes favorites. The sun likes to shine on favorites.
Just stand over and over again.
See, this is really pretty Shakespeare, right? I have no idea.
I look at that. Highs.
Mars and Pluto were in positive aspect in probably with one of them.
Most likely that's true. It's a very unusual view of seeing